The Vanguard space station hung in the void like a glittering jewel, its multi-tiered structures forming a complex latticework against the backdrop of swirling nebulae and distant stars. The station served as the crown jewel of the Interstellar Peacekeeping Corps' training facilities, where the galaxy's most promising warriors and operatives came to hone their skills under the watchful eyes of veteran commanders. The station's design reflected its purpose. Sections dedicated to specific gravitational preferences, atmospheric compositions tailored to a dozen different respiratory systems, training arenas that could mimic countless planetary conditions. Everything about Vanguard spoke of diversity, and yet, beneath the surface of interspecies cooperation ran currents of unspoken hierarchy, of rankings both official and instinctual, based on the evolutionary advantages each species brought to combat. Commander Thorvin moved through the central corridor, his crystalline body reflecting the overhead lights in shimmering patterns across the walls. As a Xylosian, his silicon-based form allowed him to process information at speeds that most organic beings could only dream of, and his rigid exterior could withstand pressures that would crush most life forms. He was, by every measure, an exemplary representative of Vanguard's philosophy. Identify your biological advantages and maximize them to their fullest potential. Commander acknowledged a passing Merindian engineer, his 12 limbs moving in perfect synchronization as he navigated the corridor, carrying equipment. Thorvin gave a curt nod, the crystal facets of his head catching the light. The Xylosian commander took pride in the discipline that permeated every level of the station. He had helped build Vanguard's reputation as the most elite training facility in the Corps, where only the strongest survived the grueling regiments. Today, however, Thorvin was troubled. He was on his way to meet their newest trainee, the first human to be accepted into Vanguard's advanced tactical program. The decision had come directly from IPC High Command, overriding his objections. Humans, in his assessment, were middling at best. No natural weapons, unremarkable strength, mediocre sensory capabilities, and skin so soft it could be pierced by the simplest projectiles. What had possessed High Command to send one here? He reached the docking bay just as the transport shuttle completed its decontamination cycle. The airlock hissed open, and Lieutenant Alara Vance stepped onto the deck. Thorvin had reviewed her file, of course. Outstanding tactical scores at the Academy, commendations for creative problem-solving, an impressive record of diplomatic negotiations in the Centauri sector. But standing before him now was a disappointingly ordinary specimen. Approximately 1.7 meters tall, with a frame that seemed almost fragile compared to most Vanguard trainees. Her skin was a warm brown, her dark hair pulled back in a regulation knot at the base of her skull, and her eyes, alert and assessing, moved methodically around the docking bay before settling on him. "Commander Thorvin," she said, saluting crisply. "Lieutenant Alara Vance, reporting as ordered." "Lieutenant," Thorvin acknowledged, the words sounding like crystals chiming against each other. "Welcome to Vanguard Station. Your quarters have been prepared with Earth-standard atmospheric composition and gravity. I trust they will be adequate." "I'm sure they'll be fine, sir," Vance replied, shouldering her regulation duffel with practiced ease. "I've been adapting to non-Earth conditions for the past 3 years in preparation for this posting." Thorvin noted this information without comment. Preparation was commendable, but no amount of adaptation could overcome fundamental biological limitations. He gestured toward the corridor. "The orientation tour begins at 0800 station time tomorrow. Until then, you're free to settle in and familiarize yourself with the station layout via your datapad. Training begins at 0600 the following day." "Thank you, sir. I'm looking forward to it." As they walked through the central hub, Thorvin observed the reactions of the other trainees to Vance's presence. A pair of Draconian cadets paused their conversation, their scaled heads tilting in curiosity. A Volgon weapons specialist, her 4 arms laden with practice blades, gave the human a dismissive glance before continuing on her way. And near the nutrient dispensary, Supreme Commander Kalen Rourke, the station's most accomplished trainee, watched the newcomer with cold, calculating eyes. Rourke was the pinnacle of what Vanguard sought to create. A Zaltar warrior with natural armor like stone, for powerful arms that could strike with blinding speed, and the ability to emit sonic waves that could temporarily paralyze most nervous systems. Standing over 2 meters tall, his gray-green scales gleaming under the lights, Rourke exuded predatory confidence. In 3 years at Vanguard, he had never been defeated in combat simulations, had broken station records in every physical challenge, and was being groomed for a high-ranking position within the IPC's Special Operations Division. As they passed, Rourke performed a formal salute to Thorvin, his face arranged in a respectful expression that didn't quite reach his amber eyes. Those eyes lingered on Vance, with something between curiosity and contempt. "Supreme Commander Rourke," Thorvin said, pausing. "This is Lieutenant Vance, our new tactical trainee from Earth." "Lieutenant," Rourke said, his voice deep and resonant. "We don't see many humans at Vanguard." "There's always a first," Vance replied evenly. "Indeed," Rourke said, a slight ripple passing through his scales, the Zaltar equivalent of amusement. "I look forward to observing your contributions to our program." The emphasis on observing wasn't lost on Thorvin, nor, he suspected, on Vance. The implication was clear. Rourke didn't consider the human a participant so much as a curiosity, perhaps even a cautionary example. Speaking of contributions, Thorvin interjected, Rourke recently led a tactical team in simulating the defense of a civilian outpost against a Class 4 incursion. His team suffered 0 casualties and completed the mission in record time. "Impressive," Vance said, and Thorvin couldn't detect any sarcasm in her tone. "I'd be interested in reviewing the simulation parameters and your approach, Commander Rourke, if that's permitted." Rourke seemed momentarily taken aback by the request, then inclined his head. "All training simulations are available to authorized personnel, Lieutenant. Though I'm not sure how much benefit you'll derive from studying tactics designed for different physiological capabilities. You'd be surprised what can be learned from different perspectives," Vance said with a slight smile. They continued the tour, leaving Rourke watching them with narrowed eyes. As they approached the residential section, a slim figure detached itself from a service alcove and fell into step beside them. "Commander Thorvin," the newcomer said, her voice melodic. "I've prepared the environmental adjustments for the lieutenant's quarters as requested." "Thank you, Cadet Lyra," Thorvin said. Lyra was a Cygnian, her translucent skin rippling with subtle color patterns that shifted from blue to green as she spoke. Like all Cygnians, she possessed natural chromatophores that could change her skin's appearance and mild telepathic abilities that allowed for rudimentary emotional sensing. Her kind were valued for reconnaissance and communication roles, though they typically avoided direct combat due to their relatively delicate physical structure. "Lieutenant Ilera Vance," the human said, offering a hand in what Thorvin recognized as a traditional Earth greeting. Lyra looked momentarily confused, then recalled her xenoculture training and carefully took Vance's hand. As they touched, a flicker of surprise passed across the Cygnian's features, and her skin momentarily flashed a deep purple, a color associated with unexpected discoveries in her species. "Welcome to Vanguard, Lieutenant," Lyra said, her colors settling back to a professional blue. "If you need any assistance navigating the station systems, please don't hesitate to ask. Some of our interfaces can be challenging for species without neural connectivity." "I appreciate that," Vance said. Thorvin noted the interaction with interest. Lyra was one of their more adaptable cadets, known for her curiosity about other species. Perhaps having her liaise with the human would be useful, both to help Vance acclimate and to gather more detailed observations about human capabilities and limitations for the training program's records. "Cadet Lyra will be your point of contact for the first week," Thorvin decided. "She's familiar with most station operations and can answer any questions that arise before your formal training begins." "Thank you, sir," Vance said, though Thorvin detected a hint of amusement in her expression, as if she understood exactly what he was doing. It was unsettling. "Your quarters," Thorvin said, gesturing to a door that slid open at their approach. 0800 tomorrow, Lieutenant. Don't be late. I won't be, sir. As the door closed behind Vance, Thorvin turned to Lyra. Monitor and report. I want to know how she adapts, what she struggles with, what questions she asks. Yes, Commander, Lyra replied, her skin now a neutral gray that betrayed nothing of her thoughts. May I ask what specific capabilities you're assessing? Thorvin considered the question. High Command believes humans possess some quality that makes them valuable to our program. I remain unconvinced. Your job is to help me understand what they see that I don't. Understood, sir. As Thorvin walked away, Lyra's skin briefly swirled with patterns of curious gold and interested teal before. She controlled the reaction. There was something about the human that intrigued her, something she couldn't quite place. Perhaps it was worth finding out what that something was. Inside her quarters, Alara Vance set down her duffel and let out a long, slow breath. The journey to Vanguard had been arduous, and the reception had been exactly as cold as she'd expected. She rolled her shoulders, feeling the familiar ache of slightly higher gravity than she was used to. They'd set the room to Earth standard, but the station's common areas maintained a gravitational pull about 1.2 times Earth normal, presumably as a compromise between the various species' homeworlds. Her quarters were Spartan but functional. A sleep platform designed to accommodate multiple physiologies, a sanitation unit with settings for water-based cleansing, a nutrient station programmed with basic human-compatible options, and a workstation with access to the station's information systems. Vance moved to the workstation and placed her palm on the interface. The system hummed, struggling to recognize her biometrics before finally blinking to life with a series of incomprehensible glyphs. Language setting, English, she said clearly. The display flickered, then reorganized into Roman characters. Basic functionality, at least, was accessible. Vance began methodically exploring the system, noting the location of training facilities, communal areas, and emergency protocols. She paid particular attention to the combat simulation archives, flagging several recent exercises for later review. After an hour of familiarization, she changed into training attire and began a series of stretches and exercises designed to help her body adjust to the station's gravitational differences. As she moved through the routine, she mentally reviewed what she knew about her fellow trainees, particularly Supreme Commander Rourke. The Zoltar were a species renowned for their combat prowess, having evolved on a high-gravity world with numerous apex predators. Their quadrupole-armed physiology gave them significant advantages in close quarters, and their stone-like dermal plating made them resistant to many conventional weapons. Most fearsome, however, was their ability to generate localized sonic disruptions. Not quite a scream, as humans might understand it, but a focused wave of sound that could temporarily scramble most neural systems. And Rourke was considered exceptional even among Zoltars. Vance completed her exercises and moved to the small, personal viewport in her quarters. The endless void stared back at her, punctuated by distant stars and the swirling colors of the Cerulean Nebula. She pressed her forehead against the transparent aluminum and allowed herself a moment of doubt. Earth's inclusion in the Interstellar Peacekeeping Corps had been controversial from the start. Humans were seen as technologically capable but physically unremarkable, lacking the natural weapons, defenses, or sensory capabilities that made other species valuable in combat or crisis situations. The prevailing attitude seemed to be that humans were useful for diplomacy, scientific research, and support roles, but had little to offer in terms of tactical or combat expertise. Vance had spent her entire career fighting that perception, and now she was at Vanguard, the pinnacle of IPC combat training, where she would either prove humanity's worth or confirm every prejudice against her species. No pressure, she murmured to herself with a wry smile, before turning back to her preparations. She had work to do. The following days were a brutal introduction to Vanguard's training philosophy. The morning began with physical conditioning that seemed specifically designed to highlight Vance's biological disadvantages. Speed trials against Arvani cadets, whose 6 legs could propel them at over 70 kilometers per hour. Strength assessments alongside Tauric trainees who could deadlift small transport vehicles. endurance tests in environmental conditions that pushed her respiratory system to its limits, while native ammonia breathers looked on with what she interpreted as pity. The technological interfaces presented their own challenges. Training simulators built for beings with more limbs or different sensory organs required constant adaptation. Tactical displays that relied on neural connectivity forced her to use clumsy manual inputs, slowing her response times in simulated emergency scenarios. Each struggle was meticulously documented by observer instructors. Their expressions, when their species had recognizable expressions, ranging from clinical detachment to barely concealed disdain. Commander Thorvin observed several sessions personally, his crystalline form betraying no emotion as he recorded each of Vance's failures and limited successes. The human continues to demonstrate suboptimal performance in physical assessments. She overheard him telling another instructor after a particularly grueling session. However, her persistence is notable. She continues despite clear physiological disadvantages. It wasn't exactly a compliment, but it was something. Cadet Lyra proved to be a valuable ally, offering quiet suggestions on how to adapt to the station's systems and occasionally running interference with some of the more hostile trainees. Trisk and Velen. The simulation began well enough, with Vance coordinating her team's movements to establish a defensive perimeter while beginning evacuation procedures. Her human perspective proved useful in predicting civilian behavior under stress, allowing for more efficient crowd management than the standard IPC protocol suggested. However, midway through the scenario, the simulation threw an unexpected complication. The attackers deployed a neural disruptor that specifically targeted the Arvani nervous system, effectively eliminating half of Vance's team in seconds. As Trisk and Velen collapsed into immobile heaps, Vance quickly reassessed the situation. Standard IPC procedure would be to retreat, sacrificing the remaining civilians to preserve the surviving peacekeepers for a counterattack with reinforcements. It was a cold calculus based on the assumption that trained IPC personnel were more valuable than the civilians they protected. Vance made a different call. Lyra, I need you to communicate with all civilians simultaneously. Tell them to gather everything reflective they can find. Mirrors, polished metal, anything that can redirect light. What? Lyra's skin flashed with confusion. That's not protocol. The neural disruptor is directional, Vance explained rapidly. It has to be, or it would affect their own forces. If we can create enough reflection points, we can turn it back on them, or at least diffuse its effect. It was a risky plan, based on Vance's understanding of the physics involved and her observation that the attackers were the same species as the colonists, likely susceptible to the same neural frequencies. To her surprise, Lyra complied, her skin pulsing with communication patterns as she telepathically relayed instructions to the civilians. What followed was chaos by IPC standards, but remarkably effective. Colonists creating a disorienting array of reflective surfaces that scattered the neural disruptor's emissions back toward the attackers, many of whom began to falter. In the confusion, Vance and Lyra managed to complete the evacuation and secure the critical infrastructure. When the simulation ended, their team had achieved an 89% success rate. Not top tier by Vanguard standards, but far better than expected given the loss of half their team. As they exited the simulation chamber, Commander Thorvin was waiting, his crystalline form reflecting the chamber's lights in sharp patterns. Lieutenant Vance, he said, voice neutral. Explain your deviation from standard protocol. Vance stood at attention. Sir, the situation called for adaptation. The neural disruptor created an asymmetric threat that standard procedures don't adequately address. By leveraging the physics of the weapon and the resources available, we were able to achieve mission objectives despite being at reduced strength. By turning civilians into combatants, Thorvin noted, disapproval evident in his tone. Placing non-combatants at risk violates core IPC principles. With respect, sir, they were already at maximum risk under standard protocols, Vance countered. The procedure would have called for abandonment once Trisk and Velen were incapacitated. My approach actually reduced civilian casualties by 47% compared to the baseline for this scenario. Thorvin was silent for a moment, facets glinting as he processed this information. Nevertheless, your approach contradicts established tactical doctrine. Doctrine exists because it works, Lieutenant. It is the distilled wisdom of centuries of combat experience across dozens of species. Doctrine should be a guide, not a constraint, Vance said, then added, Sir. Behind Thorvin, Supreme Commander Rourke had emerged from his own simulation chamber, his team having achieved a perfect score, as usual. He paused, listening to the exchange with evident interest. A convenient perspective for those who lack the natural capabilities to execute doctrine effectively. Rourke interjected, moving to stand beside Thorvin. Creative solutions are admirable, Lieutenant, but they're often just compensations for fundamental inadequacies. Vance met his gaze steadily. Every species has inadequacies, Commander. The question is whether we recognize them as opportunities for growth or excuse them as immutable limitations. A philosophical perspective, Rourke said dismissively. In actual combat, philosophy yields to biology. The strongest warrior, the fastest reflex, the most resilient body. These determine survival, not clever workarounds. Is that why the Hroshan Dominion, with all their biological advantages, fell to the technologically superior but physically weaker Mendari coalition? Vance asked. Biology isn't destiny, Commander. Adaptability is. A ripple of tension passed through Rourke's scales, and the neck muscles that controlled his sonic capabilities visibly tensed. Several nearby trainees took instinctive steps backward, recognizing the signs of Zalter. Agitation. Historical anomalies don't disprove biological principles, Rourke said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. And theoretical debates don't prove combat effectiveness. Then perhaps we should move beyond theory, Commander Thorvin said suddenly, his crystalline form shifting to what Vance had come to recognize as his interested configuration. Lieutenant Vance has presented an alternative tactical philosophy that contradicts our established doctrine. Supreme Commander Rourke represents the embodiment of that doctrine's success. A ripple of murmurs spread through the gathered trainees. A practical demonstration might be instructive for all parties, Thorvin continued. A training spar between Lieutenant Vance and Supreme Commander Rourke would provide valuable data on the effectiveness of different tactical approaches. The murmurs grew louder. What Thorvin was suggesting was unprecedented, and to many seemed almost cruel. Humans and Zalters weren't even in the same classification for combat training. It would be like pitting a juvenile against a seasoned warrior. Rourke's scales rippled with what might have been amusement. I'm willing, if the lieutenant is. Though I would understand any hesitation on her part. All eyes turned to Vance. In the sudden silence, she could almost hear the mental calculations running through everyone's minds. How quickly she would fall. How thoroughly she would be defeated. How this would finally prove the futility of sending a human to Vanguard. I accept, she said calmly. Lyra's skin flashed with alarmed orange patterns. Lieutenant. It's all right, Cadet, Vance said with a slight smile. Commander Thorvin is right. A practical demonstration would be instructive. Very well, Thorvin said, the facets of his form realigning into what might have been satisfaction. We'll schedule the spar for 0900 tomorrow in the main training arena. Standard training parameters, non-lethal force only. The objective will be incapacitation or surrender. Sir, Vance said, I'd like to review the complete anatomical and combat record for the Zalter species, if that's permitted. Since this is an educational exercise, it seems appropriate to have all relevant information available. Thorvin considered this for a moment. Granted, all non-classified biological and tactical data will be made available to both participants. This is to be a demonstration of skill and approach, not an advantage of information. Thank you, sir, Vance said. She turned to Rourke and offered a formal IPC salute. Until tomorrow, Commander. Rourke returned the salute with precise form, his amber eyes gleaming with something between anticipation and dismissal. Until tomorrow, Lieutenant. I'll try to make it instructive. As the gathered trainees dispersed, buzzing with excited discussions about the upcoming spectacle, Lyra fell into step beside Vance, her skin cycling through worried purple and confused blue patterns. "Why did you agree to that?" she hissed once they were out of earshot. "Rourke has never been defeated in training combat. He's twice your size, 4 times your strength, and has natural weapons you can't possibly counter." "Then it should be quite instructive," as the commander said. Vance replied calmly. "This isn't a joke. Thorvin set this up to humiliate you, to prove his point about human limitations once and for all." "Probably," Vance agreed, "but maybe he'll learn something else entirely." Lyra's skin flashed with exasperation. What could he possibly learn watching Rourke throw you across the arena in seconds? Vance smiled slightly. "That's assuming Rourke can throw me across the arena. And you're assuming he can't? Have you seen him fight?" "Not in person," Vance admitted. "But I will. Tonight." For the remainder of the day, Vance was conspicuously absent from the common areas. Rumors began to spread among the trainees about her whereabouts. Some claimed she was hiding in her quarters, others that she had requested emergency transport back to Earth, still others that she was in the medical bay being treated for pre-combat anxiety. In reality, she was in the station's data archives, methodically reviewing every scrap of information on Zalter physiology, combat techniques, and, most importantly, every recorded training session involving Supreme Commander Rourke. Hour after hour, she studied his movements, his patterns, his tendencies. She paid particular attention to the few moments when he seemed even slightly challenged, noting the specific circumstances and techniques that had momentarily disrupted his flow. Late in the night cycle, when most of the station was in rest phase, she made her way to a small personal training room and began practicing a series of movements, precise, economical motions that seemed oddly specific, as if designed for a very particular purpose. When morning came, the main training arena was packed beyond capacity. Word had spread throughout Vanguard about the unprecedented match, and it seemed every trainee and instructor not on essential duty had found a reason to attend. The tiered observation areas surrounding the circular combat floor were filled with bodies of all shapes, sizes, and compositions, creating a low hum of excited conversation in dozens of languages. Commander Thorvin stood at the center of the arena, his crystalline form reflecting the bright overhead lights in sharp, multicolored patterns. Beside him, a team of medical and scientific personnel prepared monitoring equipment designed to capture biometric data from both combatants. "This training exercise," Thorvin announced, his voice amplified to reach all corners of the arena, "serves an educational purpose. We will observe and analyze the effectiveness of different tactical philosophies when applied to practical combat situations." The buzz of conversation dimmed as the main doors to the arena slid open and Supreme Commander Rourke entered. He moved with fluid grace despite his imposing size, his stone-like scales gleaming under the lights. As he approached the center, a ripple of appreciative murmurs passed through the crowd. This was their champion, the embodiment of Vanguard's ideals: strength, speed, natural advantage maximized through rigorous training. Rourke took his position on one side of the central circle, stretching his 4 arms in an impressive display of controlled power. His expression was focused but confident, that of a seasoned warrior preparing for a routine exercise rather than a serious challenge. The doors opened again, and Lieutenant Ilera Vance entered. By comparison, her appearance was almost anticlimactic, a small human figure in standard IPC training attire, no special equipment, no visible weapons. She walked calmly to the center of the arena, her face composed, eyes alert and focused. If she felt any apprehension facing an opponent who outmatched her in every physical metric, she showed no sign of it. The contrast between the two could not have been more stark. Rourke, a towering example of evolved combat efficiency, and Vance, seemingly unremarkable and vulnerable. From the observation tiers, Lyra watched with her skin cycling between worried orange and hopeful green patterns. "Before we begin," Thorvin said, "I will note the relevant biological metrics for context. He gestured to a large display screen that materialized above the arena. Supreme Commander Rourke, Zalter physiology provides approximately 5 times human standard muscle density. Reaction time averages 47 milliseconds. Dermal plating resists impacts up to 22,000 newtons per square centimeter and provides immunity to most low-level energy weapons. Specialized neck musculature can generate disruptive sonic waves effective within a 10-meter radius. The display shifted to show Vance's metrics. Lieutenant Vance. Human physiology with standard strength parameters for her size and mass. Reaction time approximately 180 milliseconds. No natural armor or significant physical resistances. No natural offensive capabilities beyond basic striking limbs. There were a few chuckles from the observation tiers, quickly silenced by looks from nearby instructors. This exercise will continue until one participant signals surrender or is rendered unable to continue. Thorvin continued. Medical monitoring will ensure no permanent damage occurs. Both participants have been granted access to the same tactical and biological information. There will be no artificial advantages or disadvantages. He stepped back from the center. Combatants, prepare. Rourke assumed a standard Zalter combat stance, his forearms positioned to both attack and defend, feet planted firmly on the arena floor. Vance simply stood in a relaxed posture, hands loose at her sides, weight balanced evenly. Begin, Thorvin commanded, moving swiftly away from the combat zone. The moment the word left Thorvin's mouth, Rourke launched forward with explosive speed, covering the distance between them in a blur of motion. His front right arm extended in a grabbing motion designed to seize Vance's shoulder while his neck muscles began to contract in preparation for a sonic blast. It was a standard Zalter opening move, designed to immobilize an opponent with the initial physical contact while the sonic attack disrupted their nervous system. Against most species, it was devastatingly effective. Against a human with no special defenses, it should have been instantly decisive. Except Vance wasn't there. In the microsecond before Rourke's hand would have made contact, she pivoted sharply, her body rotating just enough for his grasp to miss by centimeters. Simultaneously, she used her forearm to deflect his momentum slightly to the side, altering his trajectory just enough to throw off his balance. Rourke's sonic attack discharged, but the slight change in his orientation meant the focused wave passed harmlessly to Vance's side. Before he could recover, Vance stepped inside his guard, using the continuing momentum of her pivot to drive her hip and shoulder into a precise point where his center of gravity was now compromised. It was a classic leverage technique from Earth's judo tradition, adapted with surgical precision for Zalter physiology. For a frozen moment, the arena watched in disbelief as the massive Zalter warrior was lifted off his feet, not by strength, but by perfect application of physics and his own forward momentum. Rourke's expression shifted from confidence to shock as he found himself airborne. His training kicked in, and he attempted to reorient himself for landing, but Vance was already moving again. As he came down, she struck with astonishing precision, not at his armored scales, but specific points where his limbs connected, where neural clusters were less protected, where the complex musculature of his sonic apparatus was momentarily exposed. Each strike was delivered with the edge of her hand or the tips of her fingers, targeting pressure points that Rourke himself might not have known existed in his own anatomy. These weren't powerful blows. They didn't need to be. They were precisely calibrated disruptions to his neural pathways, temporary short circuits in the complex biological machinery that made him so formidable. Rourke thrashed, trying to regain his feet, his forearms swinging in increasingly desperate arcs. But Vance moved like water around stone, never where his strikes landed, always just beyond his reach. She continued her methodical assault on his pressure points, each strike building on the effects of the last, gradually compromising his motor control. The Zalter attempted to generate another sonic attack, the muscles in his neck bulging with effort. But Vance had already anticipated this, her fingers striking a nerve cluster at the base of his throat with pinpoint accuracy. The sonic wave died before it could form, choking off into a strangled growl of frustration. In the observation tiers, absolute silence had fallen. What they were witnessing defied all expectations, violated every assumption. The human wasn't just surviving. She was systematically dismantling one of the most feared combatants in Vanguard. 8 seconds into the match, Rourke was visibly struggling to coordinate his limbs. His movements, normally fluid and precise, had become jerky and uncoordinated. His balance, typically flawless, faltered with each attempted attack. 10 seconds in, Vance executed a sweeping motion with her leg, targeting the back of Rourke's knee where the scales formed a natural joint. The Zoltar's leg buckled, and as he fell, Vance was already in position. She applied a neurolocking device, a standard IPC tool for temporary incapacitation that she had been permitted to carry, but that no one had expected her to be able to use effectively, to a specific point at the base of his skull where the scales naturally separated to allow for head movement. 12 seconds after the match began, Supreme Commander Kalen Rourke, undefeated champion of Vanguard, collapsed to the arena floor, completely immobilized. The training arena was frozen in absolute silence. Not a breath, not a movement, not a whisper from any of the gathered observers. On the display screens, Rourke's biometric readings showed he was conscious but unable to move, his nervous system temporarily scrambled by the combination of precisely targeted strikes and the neurolocking device. Vance stood calmly beside her fallen opponent, breathing evenly, not a hair out of place. She looked toward Commander Thorvin, whose crystalline form had reconfigured into a pattern that, for Xylosians, indicated extreme shock. "I believe the match is concluded, Commander," she said into the silence, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned arena. For several seconds, Thorvin remained motionless, facets gleaming under the lights as he processed what he had just witnessed. Finally, his voice emerged, uncharacteristically hesitant. "Match concluded. Victory to Lieutenant Vance." A sudden explosion of sound erupted from the observation tiers. Exclamations of disbelief, excited chatter, arguments breaking out between those who had seen it with their own eyes and still couldn't believe it. Lyra's skin had gone almost completely white, the Signian equivalent of utter astonishment. Medical personnel rushed forward to attend to Rourke, carefully removing the neurolocking device and administering treatment to restore his neural function. The Zoltar's amber eyes remained fixed on Vance, filled not with anger or resentment, but with something far more complex: confusion, reassessment, and perhaps the first glimmer of respect. Commander Thorvin approached Vance, his crystalline structure still showing patterns of extreme cognitive dissonance. "Explain," he said simply. Vance maintained her professional demeanor. "Supreme Commander Rourke is an exceptional warrior who has optimized his natural advantages to their fullest extent. However, that optimization has created predictable patterns. Every fighter who relies solely on their strengths eventually develops blind spots regarding their vulnerabilities." "You studied his techniques," Thorvin observed. "I studied his anatomy," Vance corrected. "All biological systems, no matter how advanced, have vulnerabilities, junction points, neural clusters, balance dependencies. The Zoltar exoskeletal structure is remarkably effective, but it necessitates gaps at joint connections. Those gaps expose neural pathways that can be temporarily disrupted with precise application of pressure." By now, Rourke had regained enough function to sit up, though his movements remained uncoordinated. He motioned the medical team back and fixed his gaze on Vance. "How did you neutralize the sonic attack?" he asked, his voice unsteady but determined. "No one has ever countered it before. Your sonic capability requires a specific alignment of specialized muscles in your neck and upper thorax," Vance explained. "When I disrupted your balance in the initial engagement, it compromised that alignment. Later, I targeted the primary nerve bundle that controls those muscles, temporarily interrupting the neural signals required for sound generation." "That information isn't in the standard anatomical database," Thorvin interjected, suspicion edging his tone. "Not explicitly," Vance agreed. but it can be inferred by cross-referencing evolutionary biology records, civilian medical literature on Zalter vocalization disorders, and observational data from previous combat recordings. The information was all there, just not assembled in an obvious way. Rourke managed to stand, though one of his arms still hung limp at his side. You developed a strategy specifically to counter me. I developed a strategy based on understanding, not force, Vance replied. That's the point I was trying to make yesterday. Biological advantages are significant, but they're not the only factor in combat effectiveness. Observation, analysis, and adaptation can overcome seemingly insurmountable physical disparities. The medical team had finished their assessment, confirming that Rourke would regain full function within hours, with no permanent damage. The Zalter dismissed them with a gesture and faced Vance directly. "You could have done more damage," he said, not as an accusation, but as a realization. "You deliberately chose techniques that would incapacitate without lasting harm." "The objective was incapacitation, not injury," Vance said simply. Unnecessary damage would have been inefficient. A ripple passed through Rourke's scales, the Zalter equivalent of a thoughtful hum. Efficiency. Yes, I see it now. Commander Thorvin had been processing the event in silence, his crystalline structure cycling through various configurations as he reassessed everything he thought he knew about human capabilities. Finally, he addressed the still buzzing crowd. "Training sessions for the remainder of the day are suspended. All instructors will report to Conference Chamber 1 for immediate tactical review. All combat data from this match is to be analyzed with highest priority." He turned to Vance. "Lieutenant, you will join us after medical clearance to provide detailed explanation of your methodology." "Yes, sir," Vance replied with a regulation salute. As the arena began to clear, trainees filing out in excited discussion groups, Lyra approached Vance, her skin still showing patterns of astonishment mixed with newfound admiration. "I don't even have words in your language," the Signian said, her colors shifting through shades of blue and gold. "You knew you could do that all along, didn't you? Even when we all thought it was impossible." Vance smiled slightly. "I didn't know for certain. I had a theory based on careful study. But theories need testing." 12 seconds, Lyra said, shaking her head in wonder. "You took down the undefeated champion of Vanguard in 12 seconds. Do you realize what this means? Everything's going to change." Looking at the expressions of the departing trainees and instructors, the recalculation happening behind every set of eyes, mandibles, and sensory apparatuses, Vance nodded. That was rather the point. The aftermath of what quickly became known as the 12-second spar rippled through Vanguard Station like a shock wave. The medical bay, typically a place of hushed efficiency, had become the unlikely center of intense activity as specialists pored over the biometric data collected during the match. "These neural disruption patterns are fascinating," Dr. Shinby said, her 6 eyes blinking in different patterns as she studied the holographic display of Rourke's nervous system. "The human-targeted junctions that aren't even in our combat vulnerability database." "Because they weren't considered vulnerabilities," replied Chief Medical Officer Traz, his gelatinous form pulsing with thoughtful colors. "The pressure required to affect those points should be beyond human strength capabilities." "Yet clearly it wasn't," Shinby countered. Lieutenant Vance didn't apply brute force. She used precise vector calculation to maximize impact with minimal expenditure of energy. In another section of the station, the tactical analysts were having their own crisis of understanding. Conference Chamber 1 had been converted into an impromptu war room, with multiple displays showing the match from every possible angle, slowed down to millisecond by millisecond analysis. Commander Thorvin stood at the center of the chaos, his crystalline form refracting light in sharp, agitated patterns as he attempted to process the implications of what had occurred. The foundational principles upon which Vanguard's training philosophy had been built, the primacy of biological advantage, the hierarchy of combat capability based on evolutionary traits, had been upended in 12 seconds by a human with no special abilities beyond intelligence and observation. The neural disruptor is part of standard IPC equipment, Tactical Specialist Vrex was saying gesturing to a frozen frame showing the device in Vance's hand. But we've never documented a successful application against a Zoltar by any species with less than twice human strength. The scales should have prevented effective contact with the neural cluster. She targeted the exact point where the scales naturally separate, another analyst pointed out. A gap of less than 3 millimeters, exploited with perfect timing. And the balance disruption technique appears to be derived from ancient Earth martial art forms, specifically adapted for Zoltar physiology, the analyst replied, pulling up comparative movement studies. The leverage principles are sound, but the precision required to execute against an opponent of Rourke's caliber is, well, we've never seen it before. Thorvin absorbed these analyses in silence, internal calculations running at accelerated rates. His initial assumption, that the Spar would demonstrate the limitations of human capability and the superiority of evolved combat adaptations, had been thoroughly refuted. More disturbing was the realization that this refutation had implications far beyond a single training match. If a human with no special physical attributes could defeat one of their most capable warriors through observation and targeted technique, what did that mean for their entire understanding of combat effectiveness, of species classification, of the very hierarchy of capability that underpinned the Interstellar Peacekeeping Corps' organizational structure? The door to the conference chamber slid open, and Lieutenant Ilara Vance entered. She had changed from her training attire into a standard uniform, her demeanor as calm and professional as ever. The room fell silent as all attention turned to her. "Lieutenant Vance," Thorvin acknowledged, his voice betraying none of his internal turmoil. "You've been medically cleared?" "Yes, sir," she replied. "No significant injuries or abnormal readings." "Unlike Supreme Commander Rourke," someone muttered from the back of the room. Thorvin gestured to a position at the center of the analyst circle. "You've been asked here to provide context for your approach to today's exercise. The data indicates a level of preparation and execution that exceeds our expectations for human combat capability." "I understand, sir," Vance said, stepping forward. She glanced at the various displays, showing her match with Rourke from different angles. "Where would you like me to begin?" "With honesty, Lieutenant," Thorvin said, his facets aligning into his most authoritative configuration. "Was this capability known to Earth's military command? Has there been deliberate concealment of human combat potential from the IPC?" A ripple of murmurs passed through the room at the implication. Vance maintained her composure, though her expression showed a hint of surprise at the question. "No, sir. There has been no concealment. The techniques I employed are derived from traditional Earth martial arts, which have been documented in our cultural submissions to the IPC database. However, they are not standard military training for Earth forces." "Explain," Thorvin pressed. "Earth has a long history of combat development by physically disadvantaged groups," Vance explained. "When faced with stronger opponents, humans have repeatedly developed techniques that leverage physics, anatomy, and psychology rather than brute force. These forms of combat fell out of mainstream military use with the development of advanced weapons, but they continued to be practiced as cultural traditions and personal disciplines." She gestured to one of the displays, showing her pivoting away from Rourke's initial grab. "What you saw wasn't superhuman ability. It was simply the application of principles developed over thousands of years by humans who needed to overcome physical disadvantages. I studied Zoltar anatomy and Rourke's specific movement patterns, then adapted traditional techniques to exploit the vulnerabilities I identified." "You make it sound simple," tactical specialist Vrex said, mandibles clicking in agitation. "Yet none of our combat analysts predicted this outcome was even possible." "Because your analysis starts from different assumptions," Vance replied. "Vanguard's combat philosophy is built around maximizing biological advantages. Mine is built around identifying and exploiting biological vulnerabilities, including my own." "Elaborate," Thorvin commanded. Vance nodded. "When I first arrived, I was subjected to physical assessments designed to confirm human limitations. I didn't contest those limitations. They're real. Instead, I accepted them as parameters to work within, not obstacles to overcome through force. She moved to one of the tactical displays and pulled up the recordings of her previous training sessions. In each exercise, I wasn't trying to match other species' strength or speed. I was cataloging reactions, movement patterns, anatomical stress points. I was building a comprehensive database of how different physiologies respond to different stimuli. For what purpose? Asked an Arvani analyst, her 6 legs shifting restlessly. To develop targeted counter techniques, Vance explained. Every biological advantage comes with built-in vulnerabilities. Enhanced muscle density creates joint stress. Natural armor requires flexibility gaps. Specialized attack organs have supporting structures that can be disrupted. The stronger the advantage, often the more specific the vulnerability. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Vance had effectively turned Vanguard's entire training program into a research opportunity. Not to prove human strength, but to identify weaknesses in supposedly superior combatants. You've been systematically analyzing our weaknesses since arrival, Thorvin said, his tone unreadable. I've been doing my job, sir, Vance countered respectfully. As an IPC tactical officer, my role is to understand both allied and enemy capabilities. The techniques I developed aren't for use against allies. They're for protecting civilians against hostile forces with biological advantages similar to the species represented here. Thorvin was silent for a long moment, his crystalline structure shifting through patterns that reflected deep processing. Finally, he addressed the room. Continue analysis of the combat data. I want complete documentation of every technique employed by Lieutenant Vance, with detailed anatomical correlation. This is now Priority 1 research. He turned to Vance. Lieutenant, you will report to my office at 0800 tomorrow. High Command has requested a full briefing on today's events. Yes, sir, Vance replied with a crisp salute. As she turned to leave, Thorvin added, And Lieutenant, your observations about Vanguard's training methodologies. They merit consideration. It appears we may have developed our own blind spots. It was as close to an admission of error as the crystalline commander had ever made. Thank you, sir, Vance said quietly. I believe we all have something to learn from each other. In the aftermath of the Spar, the social dynamics of Vanguard Station underwent a seismic shift. Species that had previously dismissed humans as diplomatically useful but tactically irrelevant now viewed Vance with a mixture of cautious respect and subtle wariness. Training sessions became more subdued, with previously dominant warriors suddenly conscious of potential vulnerabilities they had never considered. Lyra found Vance in one of the observation lounges later that evening, sitting alone and gazing out at the stars. The Signian skin displayed gentle patterns of blue and gold, colors of friendship and curiosity. The entire station is talking about you, Lyra said, settling beside Vance on the viewing bench. Some are saying you used some kind of secret human technology. Others think you must have enhanced reflexes not in your official records. Vance smiled slightly. It's easier to believe in secret technology than to accept that their assumptions might be wrong. And Rourke, Lyra asked, how is he taking it? Better than most, actually, Vance replied. He came to see me in the medical bay, asked questions about the techniques, wanted to understand the principles behind them. Once the initial shock wore off, his focus shifted to learning rather than excusing. That's surprising, Lyra admitted, her skin flickering with patterns of reassessment. Not really. The truly exceptional warriors aren't defined by their victories, but by how they respond to defeat. Rourke didn't become Supreme Commander by accident. He has the capacity to adapt. He just hasn't needed to until now. Lyra was silent for a moment, her colors shifting to thoughtful purples. What happens now? Will High Command pull you back to Earth as some kind of special asset? I don't know, Vance admitted, but I hope not. What happened today wasn't about proving human superiority or exposing weaknesses in other species. It was about demonstrating that effective combat isn't just about biological advantages. It's about understanding, adaptation, and technique. A lesson that Vanguard apparently needed Lyra observed. A lesson we all need, Vance corrected gently, including humans. We've been so focused on our limitations that we've neglected our potential. Just as Vanguard has been so focused on maximizing strengths that they've ignored the importance of understanding vulnerabilities. Their conversation was interrupted by a station-wide announcement. Attention, all personnel. By order of IPC High Command, all standard training protocols are suspended effective immediately. New directive incoming at 0900 tomorrow. All instructors and trainees are to report to main assembly hall for briefing. Lyra's skin flashed with surprised yellow patterns. That's unprecedented. Change usually is, Vance replied, turning her gaze back to the stars. The main assembly hall had never been so densely packed. Species from across the galaxy stood, sat, or hovered according to their physiological needs, all attention focused on the central platform, where Commander Thorvin stood beside a holographic projection of Admiral Zerves, the IPC High Commander. Recent events at Vanguard Station have prompted a comprehensive review of our tactical training methodologies, the Admiral was saying, her four eyes blinking in various patterns that indicated serious consideration. The demonstration provided by Lieutenant Vance has identified significant gaps in our understanding of combat effectiveness across species. A murmur ran through the assembled trainees and instructors. Effective immediately, Vanguard will implement a revised training paradigm that addresses these gaps, Thorvin announced, his crystalline form gleaming with formal authority. The new approach will balance traditional strength-based tactics with vulnerability assessment and counter-technique development. At the back of the hall, Vance stood quietly, taking in the reactions around her. Nearby, Supreme Commander Rourke watched the proceedings with intense focus, his amber eyes occasionally glancing in her direction with what might have been grudging respect. Lieutenant Alara Vance will be appointed Special Tactical Advisor to Vanguard's instruction staff, Admiral Zerves continued. She will develop a comprehensive program integrating human martial disciplines with our existing combat methodologies. The announcement sent another wave of murmurs through the crowd, some excited, others skeptical, but all recognizing the fundamental shift this represented in IPC hierarchy. Additionally, Thorvin added, Supreme Commander Rourke has volunteered to serve as primary liaison for this integration effort, providing expertise from the traditional Vanguard approach while learning the new methodologies firsthand. Rourke's scales rippled with acknowledgement as nearby trainees turned to him in surprise. For the station's most decorated warrior to voluntarily place himself in a student role was unprecedented and a powerful signal to the others. After the assembly dispersed, Rourke approached Vance in one of the side corridors, his imposing form moving with the careful precision of someone newly aware of his own vulnerabilities. Lieutenant, he said, his deep voice controlled and formal. I wish to understand the principles that allowed you to defeat me. Vance studied him for a moment, seeing past the armored exterior to the warrior beneath, one who had built his identity around being undefeatable, only to have that certainty shattered in 12 seconds. It wasn't about defeating you, Commander, she replied. It was about demonstrating a different approach to combat, one based on observation rather than overwhelming force. Nevertheless, I was defeated, Rourke stated matter-of-factly, and I wish to understand how, so that I may adapt. Vance nodded. The first principle is to recognize that all biological systems, no matter how advanced, have inherent vulnerabilities. The second is to understand that those vulnerabilities often correlate directly with strengths. Explain, Rourke prompted, his amber eyes intent. Your dermal plating provides exceptional protection, but necessitates gaps at joint connections to allow movement. Those gaps expose nerve clusters. Your sonic attack is devastating, but requires precise alignment of specialized muscles to generate. Muscles that can be temporarily disabled with targeted pressure. Your forearms give you superior striking options, but create additional balance dependencies that can be exploited. Rourke absorbed this information with thoughtful stillness. You did not overpower me. You disrupted me. Exactly, Vance said. applied physics rather than brute force, precision rather than power. These principles, they could be adapted for use by any species. With appropriate modifications, yes. The specific techniques vary depending on the physiologies involved, but the underlying concepts are universal. Rourke was silent for a moment, his scales shifting in subtle patterns as he processed this new perspective. "I have never been defeated before," he finally said. "It is educational. The best warriors learn more from defeat than from victory," Vance offered. "A human saying? An observation that crosses species boundaries," she replied with a small smile. Rourke nodded, a gesture he had adopted from human colleagues. "I will assist in integrating these principles into Vanguard's training. There will be resistance. Many believe, as I once did, that biological advantage is destiny. Change is never easy," Vance agreed, "but necessary growth rarely is." 12 seconds, Rourke said, a note of something like respect entering his voice. "You disassembled everything I thought I knew about combat in 12 seconds. That is efficient." "Efficiency was the goal," Vance replied simply. "When you lack overwhelming force, you learn to make every action count." As weeks passed, Vanguard Station transformed. Under Vance's guidance and with Rourke's growing support, new training methodologies were implemented alongside traditional ones. Study groups formed across species lines, with traditional combat superior species learning vulnerability awareness, while support species explored offensive applications of their unique physiologies. In one of the smaller training rooms, Vance observed as Rourke demonstrated a modified version of an earth martial art to a group of diverse trainees. The Zoltar warrior, once the embodiment of brute force supremacy, now moved with a new awareness of balance and precision, teaching others how to redirect energy rather than simply overpowering opponents. "Balance is the key," he was saying, his deep voice carrying authority born of hard-won humility. "Even the strongest attack creates moments of vulnerability. Learn to recognize these moments in yourself and others." Nearby, Lyra worked with a group of Tauric cadets, her Signian color-changing abilities being repurposed as a combat distraction technique rather than merely a communication method. Her skin flashed with patterns of confidence and pride as she guided the massive, six-limbed warriors through exercises in misdirection and perceptual advantage. Commander Thorvin approached Vance, his crystalline form configured in what she had come to recognize as his contemplative aspect. "The integration proceeds more smoothly than anticipated," he observed. "Even species traditionally resistant to tactical innovation have shown interest in the new methodologies." "People respond to results," Vance replied. "When they see techniques that work, ideology becomes less important." "Indeed," Thorvin said, facets gleaming thoughtfully. "High Command reports similar interest across other IPC training facilities. Your 12-second demonstration has sparked a fundamental reassessment of our combat classification system." "Not just mine," Vance corrected, gesturing toward where Rourke was patiently guiding a Merindian trainee through a leverage technique. His willingness to adapt, to learn from defeat rather than deny it, has been crucial. If Vanguard champion can embrace change, others find it easier to follow. Thorvin was silent for a moment, processing. "I must acknowledge an error in my initial assessment, Lieutenant. I viewed human adaptability as compensatory, a way to offset inherent weaknesses. I failed to recognize it as a fundamental strength in itself." "We all have our blind spots, Commander," Vance said with a slight smile. "Even crystalline beings with 360-degree vision." A subtle resonance passed through Thorvin's structure, the Xylosian equivalent of appreciative humor. Perhaps especially those of us who believe we see everything clearly. Across the training room, Rourke successfully demonstrated a counter to a technique that would have been considered unblockable under the old paradigm. The assembled trainees erupted in impressed exclamations in a dozen different languages. What began as a lesson in human capability has become something more significant, Thorvin observed. A reassessment of how we understand strength itself. Vance watched as species that had once been rigidly classified by their biological advantages now worked together, each learning from the other's perspectives and approaches. The hierarchy that had defined Vanguard was being replaced by something more nuanced, a recognition that true combat effectiveness came not from maximizing strength alone, but from understanding the complex interplay of advantage and vulnerability. 12 seconds, Thorvin used. 2. Dismantle not just a predator, but a paradigm. Sometimes, Vance replied quietly, that's all it takes to change how we see the universe. In the center of the training floor, Rourke looked up and met Vance's eyes across the room. The Zaltar warrior inclined his head in acknowledgement, not the formal salute of a subordinate, but the respectful nod of one warrior to another. Vance returned the gesture, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. The spar had indeed been for training, just not the kind anyone had expected.